This is Joseph Mendoes with virtualsheetmusic.com. In this video today, I'd like to talk about practicing and my general philosophy towards practicing. I know in previous videos I've talked a lot about very specific techniques, and even in the video, I think right before this one, I talked about sound and tone production and things like that, and I've talked about the bow and all sorts of different things. But really, the application of all these things is one of the most important things that you can do. And where we apply these things the most is in the practice room. So practicing is what I'd like to talk about today. Practicing is something that is, I think, to practice well is very, very difficult. And you have to be aware, tremendously aware of the things that you're good at and also the things that you're not so good at. A good way to go about this is to make a list. This can be a little scary, but to make a list of all the things you think in terms of cello technique that you're not so good at. Now, not specific things in like a piece. I'm talking about very general things. Like, let's say you always have trouble with your shifting, or you're always unhappy with your changes of bow, that they're not very smooth, or your string crossings are not very well controlled, or maybe staccato or spiccato, or all these kinds of things, different bow strokes, or maybe you have a vibrato on one finger that's weaker than the others. All these things are things that you would want to put on the list of things either maybe you're bad at, and then also make the list of things that you feel that you're really good at too. That's important as well. To really get kind of a clear picture of where you're at as a player. Once you've done that, then it becomes very clear to you how you need to be spending your time when you're practicing. Because very often, for many of us, it's not a question of practicing more. I know for myself, I always wish I could practice more, but there's only so much time in one day. So we have to use the time that we have very efficiently, and so we have to address those things that we feel are weak in our playing. Those are the things we have to address first, and that can be hard to do. It takes a lot of discipline to be able to do that. Now, in your own practicing, I know sometimes I can do this too. We sometimes like to indulge, and that's okay to do from time to time. For example, you're playing a wonderful melody like the Dvorak, the concerto, and so on. That we can kind of work on these kinds of things and getting this very beautiful legato. Well, what if our legato is already pretty beautiful? Well, maybe there's something else that we should be doing instead of that to kind of shore up an actual weakness in our playing, instead of making something that we already do well even better, which of course we want. But since we're kind of stuck with time being what it is, much better to address a weakness. Now, how do you address those weaknesses? Well, this is where you have to be creative. Really, the best way are specific exercises, and sometimes you need to even think of these exercises on your own, or you can even take them from the general repertoire or etudes, and you can certainly, if you have a teacher, you can ask your teacher about this, and your teacher will help you tremendously to figure out, what's the best way to address a particular problem. But sometimes even working on it in a specific exercise or in a specific etude is not enough. You have to think of the problem even differently. So be willing to think of solutions when you're practicing that seem like that they're out of left field. That seem like that, oh gosh, that could never work. For example, sometimes for me personally, if I'm having a shift, a problem with the shift, and I've tried everything that normally works to fix the problem and to help me to play the shift not only more in tune but with more musicality and confidence, sometimes I think of a completely, totally wild, off-the-wall solution, like maybe just adjusting how I sit a little bit, or changing the end pin length a little bit, or making these kinds of adjustments that sometimes can be a little bit, maybe you might consider them to be a little bit meaningless. Sometimes those little adjustments, something can just kind of click and it can work. So really be very adventurous with how you figure out solutions to problems, and you might be very surprised about what you find. Now, as far as practice time goes, now this is, everyone's different on this. You know, and in fact, I'm different on it, I would say, every day. I do have, and I do try to keep a minimum of amount of time that I'm going to practice, and I try to hit that target. If I have a day that's just so busy where I'm teaching so much or playing so much that there's no way that I can fit in the amount of time I would like to fit in, I try to at least hit that minimum. Now that minimum is going to be different for you depending upon what level you're at. For some people, for some of my younger students, I would say the minimum should be 30 minutes, which doesn't seem like a lot, but if I'm having them work on something very specific, then 30 minutes actually sometimes can be too much. So you have to kind of gauge it, and you have to know yourself. The other thing is so you have a total time during the day. On top of that, you want to break that up. And for most of us, this is just what I found, for most of us, you can't really practice for too long, or you start to lose the effect of the practice. For me, I know personally it really does depend on the day and how much sleep I get and everything, but if I'm very well rested, then I can even sometimes go up to an hour and a half and have that whole hour and a half be productive, but that's rare. Most of the time for me, my max for my mental focus and my ability to really fix things and focus on a particular problem is around 45 minutes or so. If I try to push it past that, I'll immediately notice. So never push it past what you think you can do. Remember, the key is to really just try to get in there and fix things. And if things aren't getting fixed, make sure, obviously, you have patience, but also don't be bothered if you're frustrated, because frustration, in some ways, and in some amounts, in small amounts, I should say, is a very, very, very good thing. It leads you to discover things. It leads you to try new things and maybe try a different fingering or a different bowing, or try anything until it works, so that you really become your own teacher in that way. So the other obvious things that everyone knows when you practice is make sure that you're really watching your posture, the very general things. If you're practicing for a long time, sometimes posture can kind of go out the window, and all sorts of other things can kind of get in your way. Practicing is something that we all have to do, but it should never be making noise in a room. It should never be something that you do just to kind of, you're looking at the clock and you're thinking, okay, if I practice 3 hours a day, I'm going to be the greatest virtuoso. Not necessarily. If you practice 2 instead of 3 hours, but those 2 hours are really, you're so mentally focused that your brain is almost sweating by the end of it. That can be more beneficial than saying, okay, I'm going to practice this much every day and I'm going to get incredibly good. Of course, if you can practice that much or even more than that, and all of it be mentally focused, then you'll be just fine. But you have to know yourself, and you have to know what you're capable of, and shoot for that. That's the most important thing for practice. And the last thing that I'll say about practicing is that you're not going to believe me on this, but practicing actually should be fun. Maybe if you're 6 or 7 or 8 years old, the practicing will never be fun. But once you reach a certain age, by around 12 or 13, if practicing is not something that you look forward to doing, and it's not something that you are excited about doing, then probably you're not practicing correctly. Probably you're just kind of repeating things over and over and over again. Things aren't really getting better, and there's probably some kind of more basic fundamental problem in what you're doing. Practicing should be a daily renewal of vows, I guess. We could call it that. Every day when you get up and you get that cello out of the case, that you should be happy that you're doing it. If you're not, then probably you're stuck. Probably there's something that's not working, and it hasn't worked for a while. And that's the thing to attack. And that leads me back to what I first said. Make that list. It's a hard thing to do for anybody, to look at yourself like that and to say, okay, this is what I'm good at, this is what I'm bad at, and to just try to focus as hard as you can on the bad and trying to get that bad to be better. Yeah, so sorry, I know I talked a lot in this video. There wasn't a lot of playing, but practicing is an important topic, and I thought I just wanted to cover it today. So I'd love to hear your comments. I'd love to also hear how all of you practice. Maybe you can help me in my practice and can spur me on. Yeah, so please leave your comments down below there. And once again, this is Joseph Mendoes with virtualsheetmusic.com.